Hello, everyone. I hope everyone can join in. I think we still have a few people coming, but we're going to start right now because that's when we had planned. First of all, I'd like to say thank you for joining me this afternoon. We have people from all over the world coming today. People in France, Germany, and my cousin Hugh Miller and friends in Scotland. So I really appreciate you all tuning in for my presentation. So as this presentation is titled, One Artist's Motivation, I'm going to talk about what motivates me to paint. And some of these are somewhat general terms for a lot of artists, but I think this is kind of like the guts of why we do what we do. What I'll start with is just a short bio for those of you who are unfamiliar with my background. And then I will talk about, well, I'll show a slide presentation of images. It'll show step-by-steps of paintings that were in progress. Also, I'll pick out certain parts of paintings and why they motivated me to paint. So first of all, I'll start with the bio. I have been drawing since I was a little kid, and but I never could make the connection of actually doing it for a living. So when I was a teenager, I was very fortunate to have very supportive parents. And I remember when I was a teenager, my dad said, "Why don't you put some pictures, paintings together, and have a show in the garage?" And I was like, that just sounded crazy. So in any case, I ended up going on to college and studying architecture. And I decided that architecture wasn't for me. So I moved to graphic design. And I was in graphic design here in Denver for about 4 years. And then with the support of a fearless wife, I decided to embark on a fine art career. And I've been doing that ever since. And now I think it's 33 years. I've been fortunate to show throughout the United States. I've been in group shows in Canada, France, Japan, China, just all over the place. So it's been really, really a great time. It's a very up and down career, but as you all know, but I've really enjoyed it. It's been a lot of fun, and constantly being motivated is an important part of this. Just constantly being jazzed about what you're painting and changing it up, experimenting. So with that in mind, I'd like to explain basically the mediums that I work in. I work in oils and pastels, but I've tried a variety of other medias, and these are the two that tend to come back, and I just am always working with. And I find that one or each of them complements the other. What I love about pastels is the purity of color. I like the dry medium, and I love the big sweeping strokes you can make with the side of the pastels. With the oils, I love the buttery quality and the brush strokes. So I work about 50-50. And the one advantage about working with both of these is that when you're mixing color and oils, and if you have experience with pastels, you're used to that purity of color. So when you're mixing those oils, you're looking for that quality of color. And then when you're working with pastels and you're making these sweeping strokes with pastels, you feel like you have a brush in your hand, so you keep your strokes nice and loose. So you'll notice in my presentation for the paintings that you're going to see some similarities between the two media. Okay, so from the motivational side, I really am attracted to the effects of light, and I love challenges. I love to find images where I can simplify the complexities of that scene. And in this presentation, since we have a limited amount of time, I'm going to concentrate mostly on the urban scape, and particularly two cities, Paris and Denver. And Denver's my hometown. So in this presentation, I will discuss what attracted me to some of these scenes. And but before I start that, I'd like to start with a couple notices. One is that I'm going to be having a online 2-day workshop on January 16th and 17th. So if you're, and that's a Saturday and a Sunday, and that's 9 to 4. So please get in contact with me through my email if you're interested in more information on that. And the other thing is, I had mentioned that I would be able to take some questions if the time was available. Since we have quite a few people that are joining us today, I've muted everybody, and I would ask you to just in the chat column send your questions, and then at the end of the presentations, I'll go through and pick out some questions to answer. I'm sure I'm not going to be able to get to everyone, but if you have some questions, please write them in there, because with as many people as we have, it could get a bit noisy. Okay, so let's start. I'm going to stop my video here and share. All right. This is a picture of a very dirty palette, actually. So we'll move on from that. But just shows you little my working method. Okay, talking about the palette, I work on glass. And underneath the glass is a piece of mat board, which is just a beige. And I like to work on canvases that I tint before I start to apply color. And that way I know that when I'm mixing my colors, the colors I come up with on that glass palette are going to be exactly the colors that when I apply them to the canvas. So I find that that's really good because I've in the past worked with like a darker colored palette, and then if you're working on a white canvas, the colors do change when you move them over to the canvas. So you want to stay consistent between the two. In pastels, I break up my pastels into basically 3 groups: light values, medium values, and dark values. And the way this works for me is the fact that I'm not actually looking for a specific color. What I'm looking for is a specific value. So certain parts of the painting, since I start with my dark colors, I move to my midtones, and then I finish with my lighter colors, I like to be able to just move in and grab from that certain section. What this allows me also to experiment, since I'm not necessarily looking for that exact color. And I think this is very vital in painting, because you want to be able to experiment. You want to be able to try some new things. So this is a good way to do it. And it looks pretty messy, you can see here. And of course, some of these colors are not in the right boxes because I just took this after painting. So I'm a little bit, a little disorganized here, but I try and keep them all generally light, medium, and darks in the 3 sections. I'm primarily a studio painter. What I love about this picture is they brought the horse into the studio, which I think is hysterical. And this is a class of sculptors. And I thought that really, talk about dedication. So I really kind of like this. And this is probably turn of the century. I also like to get outdoors. And I'm not sure who this artist is, but I thought this was a fairly funny approach to plein air painting. I work with flats and brights when it comes to brushes. And the reason why is I love the edge. I like to be able to grab an edge, and so that's why I stay away from the rounds pretty much. And so this is similar to like with using a stick of pastel, the sides of the pastel. I'm using broad, bold strokes, and I'm trying to keep this very loose and spontaneous and direct. My easel is very, very sturdy. This easel was built by my father, And my one request was that it could take a pounding. I never really liked the easels that are kind of rickety. So this one is very solid. He was in the science industry, and he was very meticulous in his workmanship. And this one fit the bill perfectly. So it's a very strong, solid easel. This is my studio. It extremely cleaned up. This was for a show. My studio generally only gets cleaned up about once or twice a year. And so it's showing its best face here. It's about 600 square feet with vaulted ceilings. And so I have a lot of room to play. And this actually was a show of seascapes from that I had done from out in California. We'll start with Paris. I've been to Paris about 7 times, and I just love this city. My wife used to be in the hotel industry, and so we traveled there quite a bit when we were younger, and it was very nice to stay in Paris for free. Of course, when I started to have to pay for rooms, I didn't quite stay in as nice a rooms, but still, you're in Paris. It's just a terrific place. What I love about Paris is the antiquity of the buildings, and it's still a very modern city. So you have this tremendous amount of energy. And of course, I also feel this way about New York and Chicago, and also in Denver, because there are some older buildings, not quite as old as the buildings in Paris here in Denver, but they still offer some interesting quality of color, interesting shapes. But there's something about Paris that just offers these really unique architecture and effects of light. So starting off, I love night scenes, early evening, late afternoon. So I love to wander around, and this was from a trip a few years ago, and my family was very, what's the best word to say? They were very easy to work with this, because I would wander off and then we'd connect by cell phones and then come back to the cafes. But I was just looking for these type of scenes. The quality of the picture is not that great, but I mostly am looking for structure, some kind of contrast, interesting effects of light. So I don't really need a great photograph, because most of the experimentation comes during the painting process. So that's really what I'm looking for in a photograph. So a lot of this is just taken sometimes with my small little Nikon camera, or even my iPhone. And once the painting starts, then I move away from the photograph and start to experiment with shapes and colors. This is what really motivates me, to be able to capture these type of scenes and then make them my own. So you can see it's a lot more vitality to color. I'm working, this is an oil, and I'm working also with the brushes and also a palette knife to get myself a few edges in there, quite a few edges in there. But to give it a nice spontaneous feel, showing distance and depth in the painting. When I was studying architecture at University of New Mexico, I really love the idea of structure. And so when it comes to painting, that's a motivation for me, is structure in the urban scene, the architecture, but not to make it architecturally perfect. What I'm really looking for is to give implied detail and let the viewer's eye make up the detail that's very, very loose in effect. And then using the edges, like with the palette knife or the brush, that will attract the viewer's eye. This is a pastel, and a couple ladies on a bridge. This is also in Paris. You'll notice a couple situations here where the architecture in the background is very, very loose, because what I'm trying to create is distance from where I'm standing and where that architecture is. If I had painted that architecture, those buildings more defined, more detailed, they would immediately pop forward in the painting. What I'm trying to do is take a photograph and then turn that through experimenting with colors and experimenting with distance and edges into a three-dimensional view. So distance from where I'm standing and where those buildings are. So when I'm walking around in these areas, it's what catches my eye is those contrasts of color. It's a contrast of light, a contrast of warm and cool, and of course a contrast of dark and lights when it comes to dark, mediums, and lights. So you have the contrast in colors where you can have very intense colors and very muted colors. And I want a balance of that in the painting, along with the values of warm, dark, medium, and light, where you have a nice balance of those different categories of color, and then the warm and cool colors. Still working with shapes, working with bold strokes. I am not interested in detail except towards the end of the painting. And that's just more or less the icing on the cake. This is an oil. This was near our hotel when we were there. Once again, I love that combination of the older buildings and some of the newer technology with the cars and the street lights, and using big broad shapes, getting more crisp edges with a palette knife, but really getting that intensity of color. You have all this light coming out of shops. And also these paintings are made up of a lot of abstract shapes. So when I'm combining those abstract shapes and then creating a representational image. This is in, I'm not sure which bridge this is at, but this is late in the day, early evening, sun is just going down. And it's a very cool painting in color. A lot of grays, purples, blues. So what really helped in making this painting jump was obviously the warm colors. So I'm dealing with some of these fairly muted colors with the water, some on the buildings. And then you come in with these really strong yellows, some pinks, oranges, and what else is in there? There's some reds in there as well. And all that tends to give it, it just gives it a little more excitement. It gives it a little more vibrancy. So when I talked earlier about the photographs, I'm not looking for the perfect photograph. What I'm looking for is that structure. And realize too that when you're dealing with the urban scape, you're dealing with a lot of movement. There are people crossing in front of you, you've got cars moving. So you want to just kind of capture enough to be able to give you an idea of where the pieces go, how the buildings are shaped, what the values of color are in general, and then you go into the experimenting. So this is quite a bit different from the actual photograph. Now structurally it's fairly close, but what I really wanted to push was the vibrancy in color. And when you're working with some of these nighttime photographs, it's very difficult to get really accurate color because the camera just doesn't have that sensitivity unless you set up some kind of a professional shot. So going from there to here is mostly experimenting. And this is a motivating factor for me too, because once you get into it, I really like that idea of being able to push color around, experiment with the muted colors versus the intense colors, and to really try and make the paintings pop. This is a pastel. Once again, early evening. I did do some paintings of Paris that were more middle of the day, but I'm going to concentrate on more of the evening scenes because I think the contrast is more interesting and a bit more vital. Lost and found edges. Not worried about some of the structure and accuracy of the car because your eye is going to make up that detail. It doesn't need to be added in. Make the viewer's eye work a little more. And that way they feel more engaged in the painting, and also it feels more like you're actually standing there and viewing this scene. So simplify. I love simplifying the complexities of an urban scene because there is so much information given to you. You have all these different light sources, you have movement, you have cars moving, you have all the buildings. But if you can simplify and give the effect of this is a glimpse, this is just a short moment in time, and then still play a lot with the color. It's an outdoor cafe scene, fairly classic, a lot of figures. But as you know, as you move farther back into the scene, it becomes a little less distinct because there's distance from where I'm standing and where people are moving off in the distance here. If these structures and people were more defined, they would immediately push themselves forward in the painting, and then you would have a fairly flat image. So what excites me is be able to show that atmosphere and depth in the painting. Okay, this is a pastel, and it's on a UArt 600 paper, which is kind of a light grit to it, so not too coarse. I'll go in and sketch with a piece of charcoal and just really just map where my shapes are, keeping it loose and not very detailed really, but just to show where the shapes are. Go in with my dark colors. Deep blue, burnt umber, sort of a deep green gray, using the sides of the pastel to create those shapes. I consider myself very much a shape painter. I'm not interested in starting with a lot of detail because I want to paint the painting as a whole in the beginning and throughout. Refining the street a little bit more, working with some warm and cool colors, finding that balance. This is what just excites me, gets me going. Bringing in a few more warmer colors, working in the midtones, starting to define the figures on the left. And then coming in with some of the finishing strokes. Lighter blue, light purples, yellows, oranges, and a note on the light colors. Even though the subtleties may not show in this slide or this image, I don't work with a white pastel. What I'm working with is light blue, light yellow, light pink, because I feel that every color that touches the paper has to have some color in it, and white doesn't have any color. So that's really my approach. So the lighter colors, like in these headlights, is just a fairly light blue. But then you can see the distance of the buildings in the background. So we go from this one to here. There really isn't that much more colors. There's only maybe five, six colors applied to finish it at this point. So this is just late afternoon, and the lights are just coming on the streets. This is working with a brush and a palette knife. Once again, structure, architecture, distance, lights and darks. When I'm walking around looking for these scenes. Sometimes these scenes can seem a bit mundane, and so that's a good challenge too. You see some of the color and you want to kind of drag that out and really spotlight when it comes to the painting process. It's a night scene. You can see quite a few of the abstract shapes here, and then slowly refining the ones that are closest to me. So just an edge here, a flick of color there, says more than going in really detailed with a smaller brush. Combinations of pinks, light purples, yellows, ochre colors, all of that making up reflected light. This is a pastel on one of the bridges. It's fairly cool in temperature. And like a previous one, you can see it's the oranges and yellows and pinks is what really makes the painting pop. My goal here was not to do small portraits of the people that are on the bridge because they're relatively backlit and they're moving. So I wanted to give this impression of there's movement, and this is, once again, it's a glimpse. It's a glimpse of something, and changes completely, you know, when the people have moved by. The sun has gone down, the sky is getting that sort of a gray bluish tint to it. And I really wanted to push the colors and experiment with the purples and the blues in the architecture, and all this vibrant blue in the foreground. So here's an example of a photograph. It's very typical street scene in Paris. People standing around, umbrellas. It's a little bit, the street's a little bit wet, but it doesn't really have a whole lot to it, but it has the structure that I wanted. So going from here, and then also adjusting the composition a little bit too, and came up with this. Much more vital when it comes to color, more direct in strokes, much more abstract actually in the use of those shapes. So much of what was in the background is just flicks and edges of color. My focus is really more in the foreground, and using lighter colors to carve out shapes, and then combinations of warm and cool and darks and lights. So I move on to Denver. This was an image downtown. It was during the winter, and a lot of structure. Really liked the combination of some warm and cool colors. It had a very Hopper-esque feel to it, and that was one of the reasons that I liked the scene. I try and I'm a fan of art history and history in general. So I study a lot of artists from the turn of the century, from the 1800s to the 1900s, and I found their work to be just fascinating. These would be the Russians, the Spanish, the English, obviously the French, and the Americans. And they had just, I mean, they knew how to draw. They had a great feeling for approaching shapes, and they had a good sense of color. So I'm a big fan of that era in painting. So really pushing the color, working with a brush, palette knife, edges, flicks of color, some muted color, some obviously more intense colors. So you don't need a perfect photo to be motivated. really coming across with more warmth in the painting. So this is a smaller pastel of an interior lobby of a hotel, one of the older hotels downtown. So using big, broad shapes of color, edges, some bright colors over some muted colors, but trying to keep it very spontaneous, very loose, and very bold. So this is the effect of the lobby, and also the effect of light, which I think is probably one of the greatest motivators for me, is the effects of light. Is whether it's artificial light, natural light, late in the day light, reflective light, all of that attracts my eye. And it'd be scenes where you walk by and you may not actually pay attention to, you may not really, it may not grab you right away, but you, on a second look, you think, oh, this could really be an interesting painting. And this, we have a light rail here in Denver. So this is a fairly large painting. This is about 36 by 48. And working once again with a brush, palette knife. You have structure in the background. You have these trains. This is late in the day. Sort of a vivid sky in the background as well. You have the highway going by on the side. It's very urban, I guess is the best way to describe it. But I really wanted to bring a lot of color into this painting. And the use of edges and lines, but just hinting at where those are, not to get too structurally perfect with it. This is our downtown area. It's a very old hotel called the Brown Palace Hotel. Darks and lights, warm and cool colors. All of this excites my interest. And plus the complexity of an urban scene and trying to simplify it. This is just a little neighborhood scene. I like the structure, not really much color there, but what really attracted this scene for me was the snow in shadow. I wanted to see how I could bring out color in the snow and the shadow in contrast with the snow that's lit. So this is what I came up with. Much more vivid, very loose, broad strokes, broad direct strokes. This is about a 9 by 12, and this was a demo I had worked on. Not worrying about a lot of the detail, just trying to grab the moment. Warm and cools, darks and lights, intense colors versus more muted colors. Finding that balance through there. That's really what gets me in charge of working on these images. This is about a 36 by 48. When I would be taking my son to school, this is a house we passed every morning. And it's a little ramshackly, but I just love the structure of it. And this goes back to my interest in architecture. So I wanted to create that with big solid strokes, interesting light hitting the side of the building. But much of this in the background is only for support. I didn't want to get very detailed with the trees, the bushes, for that matter, even the road. Because this is all supporting my focus right here. And you get a little bit of the light coming through on this building, and then you have the shadow below it. And texture, creating texture, scraping the paint with a palette knife, sort of vigorous brush strokes, gives the painting more character. So you want to kind of have that personal touch to it, and your technique and the character of your strokes. This is a good example of really pushing color. This was a scene, it's very backlit, a little late in the day, but I like the shapes. We were on our way to go to a restaurant, and the restaurant was right around the corner, and this scene kind of jumped out at me. But frankly, it's almost like a black and white scene. So pushing the color. So combinations of purples, dark browns, blues, deep greens. So those large shapes, I'm keeping them as just solid shapes, and combination of warm and cool colors to really make the painting pop. And you can see it's quite a bit different than the photograph. The photograph doesn't really offer me a whole lot of information when it comes to color. And also coming up with the vitality of the sky, the warm and cools, hard and soft edges throughout. And then just hints of some of the telephone or what do you call it? The pole wires and the street lights. Just hinting that with just the edge of a palette knife. Really warm and cool colors in here, where the last of the sun is starting to just kind of bounce around in there. So this is one of the old warehouses along this one street called Broadway here in Denver. And I liked the combination of the artificial light and then the sun setting late in the day sky, and then all this traffic moving in front. So the structure is what attracted me, and then just the added effect of some of this contrast, some colors and lights. Once again, really pushing the color. Very, very abstract in a lot of the approach of the brush strokes, shapes, edges, just hints of detail, where you have areas that are very warm and then cooling it off with sort of a greenish gray. So you're getting that balance through the painting of warm and cools. An interior scene of a restaurant. Love the windows. Just what you can see, there's foliage out there, but not being very detailed. And the closer you get to where you would be standing, there's more definition. An old theater in Denver, the Mayan, or Mayan. Really pushing the colors, late in the day, sunset. This is a pastel. I love those sort of grates in the middle of the street where the steam's coming out. Farther back in the painting, much, much looser, a little more definition in the foreground. Creating that depth of field and distance. An atmosphere. You get the reflective light of a sort of a wet street. One of our older neighborhoods in town, late in the day, sunset, shadows are creeping up. So you have these older buildings, all this foliage that's just reflecting this great light, and some cars along the street. Near our art museum. A lot of structure and distance in this one. Edges. Our art museum has a very unusual shape to it. If you ever get a chance, you can look it up on the line. But but this is the shadow of the museum, the line going all the way across. Flicks of color, dragging the paint across using a palette knife and brushes. Light coming out of the shop windows, warm and cools, and edges. These are the scenes that is where the color becomes more jewel-like. You get a lot of color, a lot of light bouncing around, but it's still early evening. And I do love to paint other type of scenes. I love still lifes. I love figurative work. As you saw, some of these interiors, and I also enjoy, painting out on landscapes as well. But I tend to gravitate back to a lot of the urban scenes because they're very challenging, and they really, it's easy to avoid painting the same scene because you have so much available to you, and you really have a very a vast amount of images you can work with, because it all changes, and it actually changes within minutes because of the moving the cars and the lights changing. This is a large piece. This is 36 by 48, mostly all in shadows with that late sun hitting the buildings, these sort of warehousey buildings, and our baseball stadium is in the background. This one is a little higher key in color. Even the shadows are almost more even in the midtones, but it was a very, very bright day. A lot of abstract shapes in the background, and then just defining these shapes in the foreground and in the figure. One of the older neighborhoods. Okay, these next 5 images just shows you the quality of pressure that applies to pastels and edges and overlapping of colors, and also the abstract quality of these strokes. You can see strokes are going in a different direction. The amount of pressure I put down on the actual paper where it becomes more opaque, and then where the darker colors just a little bit lighter, so you see a little bit of the paper showing through. You can see much more pigment in the areas that I really press down hard on. Bold, direct strokes, thick and thin. Hits of color. Detail, very loosely applied. You see where the contrast of where your values are quite different. You have a more harder edge, less so when the values are similar. So it's lost and found edges. That's actually a foot, just to give you a hint. Very abstract, that's a figure. But I'm not interested in painting the eyes, the nose, any of that. Just want to give you the overall feel of the scene. So all of that makes up that painting. This is the first part. This is the second part. It's the third part. Fourth. And then the fifth. So, an arrangement of abstract shapes that creates a representational image. And this is how, for me, I achieve that depth and distance and atmosphere in a painting. And constantly being motivated by these scenes and these challenges. And urban scenes are very challenging. It's what you leave out, in most cases, is more important than what you put in. So this is an oil, starting after mapping it out with a Conte crayon on a linen surface with some tinted gesso. Go in with a big brush. I love to start with the bigger brushes and then slowly work my way down to, not a small brush, but a little bit smaller brush. Big shapes, dark greens, some purples, some deep umber colors. Start to refine more of the shapes, bring in some cooler colors. But you'll notice these are big, broad strokes. Working the foreground. Bringing in some more of the mid-tone colors. And that's the end. So I'll go back. So the last bits are just hits of color, just defining some of those shapes, but not going overly detailed. Because as mentioned earlier, if I heavily detail the areas in the background, it immediately brings those shapes forward and flattens the image. This is our backyard. Sunset. Kind of an interesting arrangements of shapes and colors. And me painting for real out in the outdoors, not on an edge of a roof. So that is the end of that presentation. I will see, stop sharing. Okay, and I will look at some of the questions here and see if I can answer a few of these. Let's see here. Okay, the question is, your perspective is perfect in most areas, but looser in the less important areas. How do you choose which lines are crucial and which lines can be less exacting? Mostly it's what is more in the foreground is going to be a bit more exact because it's closer to me. So I'm painting very much how my eye sees the scene as opposed to what the camera offers me. So the images or the nuts and bolts of the foreground, the shapes, they're going to be a little bit more defined. The background, I'm not going to be able to see that kind of definition. So it does become less exact. Next question, what size are the finished works usually? My work from anywhere from about 8 by 10 inches all the way up to 48 by 72 inches. So 4 feet by 6 feet. It's just bigger brushes, more paint. Let's see. How often do you refer back to your original reference paintings while you're working? Do you tape it to your easel or do you set it aside completely? Reference photo, I mean. From in the beginning, I want to get the structure fairly accurate. I want to be able to not have to do a lot of changing the composition when you're in the meat of the painting, because that can get to be a little chaotic. So I am referring to the images in the beginning of the painting towards the middle of the painting. And then I start to kind of disregard the photo because now I'm in the painting and that's what I'm really concentrating on. The photographs are really kind of the starting point. Once I get the structure, get a kind of a feel for the the composition I want and what kind of color I'm going to be working with, then the photograph becomes sort of beside the point. And a lot of that too has to be that, you do want to paint outdoors and get away from photographs and see color in its sort of its natural light. So when I'm working with those photographs, and the photographs aren't going to be that accurate. They're really going to be a bit of, it's a mechanical representation of that image. And so, you know, it's through the camera, and stuff's going to be missed, the subtleties of color. So you have to improvise a great deal. But they are, you know, photographs are crucial when there's a lot of movement, the light's changing very quickly. There is no other way. It's very difficult to paint on site an urban scene, have the traffic stop for a couple hours so I can get everything down. People are very uncooperative in those situations. Let's see here. Do I do preliminary sketches for all your paintings? Not really. Mostly what I'm doing is mapping out the shapes when I start the painting. But I have in the past worked just pen and ink drawings, and it's important that you get your drawing as accurate as possible. So constantly be drawing, have a sketchbook, and just, I mean, this is the way that you get very familiar with shapes, and have your drawing be as easy as your handwriting. Okay, let's see. Do you create colors with pastel? Meaning you want a green but use blue and yellow and not a green pastel? Yes, overlapping. Overlapping pastels. My actual set of pastels is not that extensive. It all fits in a fairly small box. And I actually created a pastel set for Richardson Company, and I titled it the Desmond O'Hagan Essential Pastels. And there are only 40 pastels in the box. And with the combination of overlapping colors, a little bit of blending, I pretty much can get any painting I want with roughly about 40 to 50 colors. And that's really, in most cases, when you have a large pastel set, you'll realize that you don't really use a great many of those pastels. The ones you keep replenishing and buying, though, you'll find that you have a certain group of colors that you go back to. And then you add some to experiment with and try some new stuff. But my approach to pastel is very similar to my approach of painting. Oil painting is the fact that I'm using 2 or 3 colors to create a third color, fourth color, and I use pressure and overlapping of the colors. It says here, let's say you have a reference painting at a certain time of day with certain lighting. You like the structure of the shape and architecture in the photo, but do not the lighting. Do you ever change your painting to a completely different time of day? Not really, because I think that you're going to miss some of the technical accuracies in that way. Sometimes you may end up not having accurate shadows. So I'd like to have the scene be close to what I would like to paint. Now let's see here. Okay, it says, what pastel supports do you use? I do like the UArt, but not quite so gritty, so like the 600. I also like Canson, the smoother side, which is not very rough at all. The one advantage with the Canson, even though it can be a very unforgiving paper, is the fact that you got to put your color down and you move on. There's not much you can overlap a whole lot with. So people do tend to get a little bit hesitant with that paper. But I recommend both of those. But I've painted on a variety of papers, so I've kind of seen most of them at this point. I'll do a couple more here. Do you have periods of apathy, disillusionment? If so, how do you cope, overcome them, and find your motivation again? I think that is true to a point. I think you have your ups and downs as a painter, but constantly challenging yourself is an important part. And if you feel that you don't have that enthusiasm to paint, go to the galleries, go to the museums, recharge your batteries. That's, I find, is very helpful. I have a slew of art books in my studio. And when I'm just not enthusiastic about painting, I'm just looking through the art books. But you also have to give yourself some time off. You can't be so obsessed with painting that it tends to burn you out, because that does happen in this this business. Is you can burn yourself out, or you can be painting the same painting over and over again. You must challenge yourself. You must try new things. Look at new paintings. Try and look at as much of the good art that's out there. And there is a lot of good art out there. Is there a Desmond O'Hagan coffee table book in the works? Haven't got one yet, but who knows? Possibly in the future. I know that there's a lot of self-publishing going on these days, and I have looked into it a little bit. So it could be possible. I will also be doing some more of these seminars in the future. And so I hope you'll tune in again. So I think we're pretty close to our hour. Unless you have any other questions you would like to write in. I think that's it. Make sure I didn't miss anything. Oh, do you restrict your palette? When it comes to my oil painting, I'm only working with a certain group of colors. What I work with is ultramarine blue, cerulean blue, viridian, alizarin crimson, burnt sienna, cadmium red light, cadmium orange, cadmium yellow light, and then titanium white. So that's what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 colors and white. And that I pretty much can get whatever I want from that palette. So I don't like a large palette. Similar with my pastels, I try and keep them relatively limited. And let's see if I missed any other questions here. Desmond, do you use thumbnails? Mostly in the beginning, when I first started painting, I did do some thumbnails many years ago. But now I kind of do them mostly in my head. I'm working my composition and not really doing a lot of thumbnails. I love to do that, experimenting in composition pretty much on the surface of the painting. So I think that is it. I'm looking to see if there's any other questions, but I don't not see any more. I hope I got everybody's questions at this point. But in any case, well, thank you very much for tuning in. I'll, if you are interested in more information on the 2-day workshop in January on the 16th and 17th, please get in touch. And that's an online workshop through Zoom. And I think that's it. So thank you again. Appreciate you tuning in.